can have a seat. This morning I want to talk about how to tame your tongue. Evidently, when I was a child, that was a problem for me. There were certain words that were off limits around my house. You got to keep in mind, I grew up as a child of the 60s, so discipline looked a little bit different in those days. So sometimes I would cross the line in my speech, and when you did that in my home, that entitled you to a nonstop trip to the kitchen sink. So once at the kitchen sink, my mom would reach underneath and grab the bottle of Palmolive. And if you notice on the instructions for Palmolive, it says not only is it good for washing dishes, it's also good for washing kids' mouths out with soap. So she would. So I actually wondered whether I should tell you this because you're going to accuse my mom of child abuse. Did I mention I was raised as a child of the 60s? So she would put a drop of that Palmolive on my tongue. And I'm telling you, that one made me want to change my speech. In fact, I learned something from that. While I didn't change the way I talked around my friends, I learned that there are certain words you never say in front of my mom, lest you want the taste of Palmolive in your mouth. So my mom, what she did, she was trying to tame my tongue, tried to help me control my mouth, and it did work to an extent. It did afford superficial change, but not substantive change. She revised my behavior or reformed my behavior, but she didn't transform my speech. And as I moved into adulthood, I found myself wanting to tame my tongue, wanting to change my words. I got tired of the words that come out of my mouth being crippling for those that were around me. I didn't want to use words that were not only critical, but words that were complaining, like cussing. Like I knew that cussing was an affront to God because it complained against his sovereignty and denied his goodness. And I didn't want that in my mouth. Like I mentioned, I didn't want speech that crippled those around me, corrupted those who were around me. Like I knew if I yelled at my wife, that wasn't a good use of my tongue. It crippled my wife. And if I engaged in telling jokes that were a little bit off color, instead of building people up, I ended up corrupting them. And I didn't want speech like that coming out of my mouth. And I ran across verses like Colossians 4 and 6, where Paul says, let your words be gracious, seasoned with salt. Or Ephesians 4:29, make sure that your words build up and that they're for the benefit of those that are around you. That's the kind of speech I want. But how is it that I tame my tongue so I end up with those kinds of words that come out of my mouth? And I've come across this biblical principle. When it comes to taming my tongue, to tame my tongue, it requires first changing my heart. So moralism would say the way you change your tongue, you tame your tongue is number one, you use Palmolive and you put soap on your tongue. But that's not what Jesus teaches. Jesus teaches if you want to tame your tongue, you got to change your heart. In fact, he said this in Matthew 12, out of the abundance of the heart, the mouth speaks. It's from the heart that the mouth speaks. So if you want to tame your tongue, you got to first change your heart. And that's what James teaches. In fact, I would encourage you to open your Bibles to James chapter 3. That's the point that James is making there. In James chapter 3, when he begins that, he begins with this command, not many of you should become teachers. In other words, before you speak, certain things need to be true of you. And as he moves through verses 1 through 12, he gives a number of reasons why speech needs to be managed. You remember reasons like you'll be judged based on the words that come out of your mouth. Or another reason, your words have tremendous potential for benefit. Or another reason, your words have tremendous potential to do harm. For all these 6 reasons, You've got to tame your tongue. You've got to be careful, which raises this question, how do I do that? And that's the question that he's answering in verses 13 through 18. He writes, who is wise and understanding among you? Let them show it by their good life, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. But if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition in your hearts, do not boast about it or deny the truth. Such wisdom does not come down from heaven, but is earthly, unspiritual, demonic. For where you have envy and selfish ambition, there you find disorder in every evil practice. But the wisdom that comes from heaven is first of all pure, then peace-loving, considerate, submissive, full of mercy and good fruit, impartial and sincere. Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness. When I read those verses, particularly in context, I find James saying there are three things that are required if you and I are going to tame our tongue. If you want to manage the words that come out of your mouth, the first thing you have to have is the right aim. And that aim is a humble approach to life. Let me explain what that means and how that applies to speech. James in verses 13 and 14 moves from the general to the very specific. He begins with this question in verse 13. Who among you is wise and has understanding? Those who teach, those who speak, must not only speak truth, but it must be truth that's rooted in understanding or in practice. So for James, those who teach, those who speak, they not only need to say what's right, they need to make sure that their behavior matches their words. In other words, your mouth and your feet need to line up. So what kind of conduct or understanding is he talking about? He gets a little bit more specific, and he says, let them show it by their good life. So that understanding is a good life. Well, what kind of good life are you talking about, James? He goes on, by deeds done in humility that comes from wisdom. James is saying if you want to change your tongue, you've got to learn to be humble. Well, what is humility? I don't know about you, but that's a word that's hard for me to wrap my arms around. And so what James does is he gives us the opposite as he continues to move forward. He says, by deeds done in humility that come from wisdom, but if you harbor bitter envy and selfish ambition. The humility that James is after is the exact opposite of bitter envy and selfish ambition. Bitter envy and selfish ambition are actually synonymous. They're saying the same thing. And they refer to someone who tries to get their way by taking advantage of other people, and that at any cost. Bitter envy and selfish ambition are my attempt to get what I want at your expense, regardless of the cost. And what James is saying is humility is the exact opposite of that. Humility is not trying to get what I want from you at any cost. Instead, humility, in the sense James uses it, is laboring for your benefit. I would say it this way. Taming my tongue requires that I humbly desire to build others up versus pridefully using people to make much of myself. James says if you want to change your tongue, tame your tongue, this is where it begins. It begins with this right aim, and that's having a humble approach to life, having a humble heart where I desire to build people up instead of pridefully using people to make much of myself. I mean, if you just think about that definition. So my ambition is to build you up, not use you to get what I want. Then that means out of my mouth there will be no gossip. Because gossip is not building you up, it's using you to get what I want. It means that from my mouth there will be no unkind remarks. Because unkind remarks don't build you up, they just use you to get what I want. There will be from my mouth no lying about other people, because lying about other people is me using you to make much of myself instead of building you up. There will be no harsh attacks on your character. If you want to tame your tongue, it begins not with putting soap in your mouth, but it begins by making sure you're aiming at the right thing. And the right thing is humility, this humble approach to life. Let me illustrate it with a story that a guy named Ron Jensen told. He models what it looks like to have a humble approach to life. He showed up at a friend's house. The friend had asked him to bring some chairs over, knock at the door. His friend opens the door. He says, "Ron, where are the chairs?" Ron says, "I forgot them." And his friend said, "Well, it figures." So you can imagine the kind of internal conversation that provoked in Ron. You know, this guy thinks I'm useless. This guy thinks that I'm incompetent. This guy is saying I can't be counted on for anything. I bet he has problems of his own, probably like 12, where I have one. And so you get this internal conversation. But Ron had learned this principle of humility. So instead of responding in a way that makes much of him, he responded in a way that made much of his friend, valued his friend. So a little bit later on, he turned to his friend and he said, "So when I came to the door, knocked, opened it, you asked if I brought chairs. I said no, and you said it figures." Before he could go on, his friend said, "Dude, I am so sorry about saying that. Let me explain." So this whole day, I've had like 5 or 6 different meetings. And in every meeting, my day is messed up because somebody had promised to do something that they didn't. And so when I said to you, "It figures," that wasn't a comment on your character. It more was a comment on the kind of day that I'm having. But notice what Ron's humble response resulted in. Instead of attacking his friend, he valued his friend. And because he responded in humility, he actually saved a relationship, which is what James is saying. When it comes to taming your tongue, the first thing you need to aim at is humility. And that's a life of humility. There's a second thing that's required. Not only the right aim, but you got to have the right ambition. Those who have tamed their tongue aim at humility, and they have this ambition of peaceful influence on others. Peaceful influence on others. If you notice in verse 16, he says, "For where you have envy," remember he's just talked about envy and selfish ambition. He says, "Where you have envy and self-ambition, here's what the result is. There you find disorder and every evil practice." Notice that he's moving from attitude or aim to effect. So here's what the effect of my aim is. If my aim is pride, if my intention is to make much of myself, the end result is disorder and every evil practice. So if you doubt it, here's a little test you can take. So this afternoon, if your spouse or a friend says something that kind of hits you a little wrong, just respond to that pridefully instead of humbly. Attack them, maybe raise your voice, and just see what happens. My money says that the end result is going to be disorder and every evil practice. That's what happens when you have a prideful response to speech. But if your response is aiming at humility, look what happens. Verse 18. "Peacemakers who sow in peace reap a harvest of righteousness." Those who have this humble attitude, the effect on the world around them is completely different than the other. Instead of disorder, you get this harvest of righteousness. And that harvest of righteousness manifests itself in peace. Doesn't that sound good? Like as a result of your speech, instead of there being disorder and discord and tension in your home, wouldn't you rather have peace? I read a story about a new rabbi in New York City. He took over a synagogue. When he got there, he was really surprised. The behavior of the people that attended this synagogue was horrible. Half the group, when it came time to pray, would stand, and instead of praying, they would sneer and speak harshly at the people who sat, accusing them of denying tradition. Whereas the people who sat while prayer was going on would yell and scream at the people who stood, accusing them of denying tradition. So this young rabbi, he tried everything to bridge the gap between the two, but he couldn't do it. And so he decided to visit the former rabbi and ask him, what's tradition at this synagogue? So he goes and visits this old rabbi in the nursing home. And he said, so here's the problem. I just got to ask you, what is the tradition? Is the tradition in our synagogue to stand and pray? And the old rabbi said, no, that's not the tradition. And he goes, finally. So now I see the tradition is to sit and pray. And the old rabbi said, no, that's not the tradition either. And this young rabbi threw his hands up. He says, great, so I'm doomed to chaos. Yeah, I got a group that stands and prays and screams at those that sit. I got those that sit and scream and yell at those that stand, accusing each other of tradition. And the old rabbi said, that is tradition. So some of you grew up in a home like that, where disorder and discord is tradition. People fight and bicker at each other, and there's just disorder. Some of you, the home you currently live in is like that. Like your relationship with your spouse is marked by disorder, speech that is not beneficial and doesn't build up, but you're tearing each other down. Your tongue is not tame. James says it doesn't have to be that way. Your relationships don't have to be that way. You don't have to ruin the emotional well-being of your kids because of the way you speak. You don't have to destroy the intimacy in your marriage because of the way you speak to each other. You don't have to destroy the intimacy of your relationships in general because of the way you speak to each other. James says your tongue can be tamed. It begins with the right aim and the right ambition. But hear me and hear me well. While those two things are essential, the right aim and the right ambition are essential because they give you the motivation to want to change, they are not enough. It's not enough just to have the right aim and the right ambition. James says in order to tame your tongue, you've got to have the right action. And the right action is this: not to put a drop of soap on your tongue, not to put duct tape over your mouth. The right action is a constant reliance on Jesus Christ. Here's what I want you to hear. As much as you want to be a humble person, as much as you long for peace in your home and peace in your relationships, you do not have the power to make that happen. Only Jesus can do that. I mean, watch Jesus' life. Watch the way he went about, the way he related to other people. I mean, he's called to feed 5,000 people, a stressful situation. The disciples are freaking out. And what's Jesus doing? He's giving thanks to his Father. I mean, they're on the sea, the waves and the wind. The disciples, again, are freaking out. And where's Jesus? He's at peace and he's asleep. Think about it in the garden. I mean, Peter raises the sword to fight, and instead Jesus lifts his hand to heal. Think about the cross. Peter, reflecting on the cross, said, 1 Peter 2:23, that Jesus uttered no threats. Think about that. He's on the cross and he uttered no threats. But he continued to entrust himself to the one who judges righteously. Doesn't that sound good? And the incredible thing is that same Jesus offers that disposition to you. And the way you get it is by spending time with him through constant reliance on him. Remember Matthew 11:28, where Jesus said, "Come to me, all you who are weak and heavy laden." And maybe that's the way you feel this morning because of your speech. "Come to me, all you who are weak and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I'm meek and humble of heart, and you will find rest for your souls." Learn from me. The change, the power to change comes not from yourself. It comes from above. In fact, that's what James says. Verse 15, he says, such wisdom, he's talking about those who are marked by bitter envy and selfish ambition. Such wisdom does not come down from above, but it's earthly, it's worldly, it's unspiritual, it's natural, it's fleshly, and it is demonic, it's damnable. But look in verse 17, but the wisdom that comes from heaven, the wisdom that is humble, the wisdom that results in peace, it comes not from within, but it's coming down from heaven. And it is first of all pure. It's the wisdom of God that purifies a person from all selfish ambition and bitter envy. It purifies the heart. Then it's peace-loving. It results in relationships where there is order and unity and love, not discord. It is considerate. It's marked by grace. It's this wisdom that comes from above that changes your speech to submissive. It doesn't mean that you always do what other people say, but it means that you're pliable. You're willing to listen to what other people have to say, take that into account, and make adjustments where necessary. It's full of mercy and good fruit. That means you feel the pain of other people, and then you step in to do something about it. It's impartial. It's rooted in Scripture, and it is sincere. It's genuine. You're not putting on an act, but really is who you are. That's what happens when you become intimate with Christ. He changes your very nature, and as he changes your heart, then he changes your speech. I read a great story about a girl from Australia. Her last name was Brennan. She's known for this miracle that happened to her. So she's 15 years old. She needs a liver transplant. She goes into the hospital 2008, and not only does she get a new liver, but something happened in her body where her whole blood type changed. Like she was O negative, and her body adopted the cell, not cell structure, but adopted the immune system of that liver and completely changed her blood type. Like that had never happened. Doctors said it was a 1 in 6 billion miracle. In fact, they described it this way. The doctor said the blood stem cells in Brennan's new liver invaded her bone's marrow, taking over her entire immune system. She now has an entirely different kind of blood that welcomes life rather than carrying death. I tell you that because that's what Jesus will do for you. Just like her blood type completely changed into the blood type of the donor's liver. So when you spend time at the feet of Jesus, your whole nature will change. And you will end up with the nature of Jesus Christ. His speech is full of peace. His heart is completely humble. And you spend time around him, you're changed into his likeness. If you want to tame your tongue, it requires changing your heart. So just as I close, how is it that you spend time with Jesus? How is it that you cultivate this constant reliance on him? Let me give you 3 things that I think are required. The first is you got to receive Christ. You got to receive Christ. Those who have received Christ understand that there are 3 things God can't do. I know I say this all the time. 3 things God can't do. First, those that have received Christ understand that God cannot love them any more than he loved them. John 3:16, for God so loved the world. God is perfect. He is eternal, which means that his love for you is perfect and without measure. God cannot love you any more than he loves you, and he can't give you a better gift than he's given you. He loved us and wanted a relationship with us, but we could not have a relationship with him. So God sent Jesus Christ to die on a cross to pay for sin. John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son. And he cannot make forgiveness and reconciliation with him any easier than he's made it. That whoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. When a person believes in Christ, Jesus' payment for their sin on the cross is counted to their account, and they are considered forgiven, righteous, justified before God. Not because they did anything, but because Jesus did everything. Let me tell you why that's so important. So if you're going to change your tongue, it requires sitting in the presence of Jesus Christ. But you can't have access to that presence until you have the Son. God cannot allow sin in his presence. Your sin has to be taken care of, and that's what Jesus did on the cross. When you receive Christ, you have open access into the presence of God. You got to receive Christ. The second thing you got to do is you got to remain connected to him. The first verse you could put down would be John 3:16. This verse would be John 15:4, where Jesus says, abide in me and I in you. As the vine cannot bear fruit apart from in itself apart from the vine unless it abides in the vine, so neither can you bear fruit unless you abide in me. So the goal is not put soap on my tongue or duct tape across my lips or staple my mouth shut. The way you change, Jesus says, the way you bear fruit is you cultivate constant communion with him. Like for me, the way it looks is I get up in the morning and I hear God speak to me through his word, and then I respond to what he says through prayer. You know, I kind of begin the day by connecting with him, and then as I go through the day, I'm relentless in trying to make sure I do the things that enable me to continue to hear his voice, to remain connected with him. So I'll memorize scripture that I'll review during the day, and that keeps me connected with him. I'll listen to Christian radio because that helps me. Worship music helps me remain connected with him. I'll listen to preachers, not myself, that's horrible. But I listen to other preachers because they help me remain connected with him. And the reason I do that is because I know as I remain connected to him, then I am transformed into his likeness, which leads to the third thing, remain connected and then respond consistently, which is all you're doing. As you remain in him, he begins to transform you, and then you just respond to that transformation. Here, I would encourage you to write down John 14:15. It's a great verse. Jesus says, if you love me, you will keep my commandments. It's funny, I always turn that on its head. I read it, if you keep my commandments, then you love me. But that's not what Jesus said. Jesus said, if you love me, if you cultivate intimacy with me, if you sit with me and dine with me and are in fellowship with me, if you love me, if you're loving me, then the natural result will be you'll keep my commandments. You just respond to the work that's in him. You know, wouldn't it be something? You sit with Jesus and allow him to transform your life, and 6 months from now you think, you know, sweetheart, it's weird. We hadn't yelled at each other in 6 months. I can't remember the last time we yelled at each other. What happened? Jesus changed you. You know, your kids may say, Mom, Dad, like what has happened to you? Like y'all are gentle and kind. You don't fly off the handle at me anymore. You don't criticize me. What happened? And you realize, Jesus has changed me. And the way you relate to other people, you know, when somebody ticks you off, you don't cut them off in traffic and tell them things that you shouldn't tell them, but you find yourself marked by peace. What happened? That's the change that Jesus brings about. There's a scientist at MIT in 1961. His name was Edward Lorenz. He discovered what is called the butterfly effect. Have you ever heard of that? The butterfly effect. He noticed that small things, given enough time, can make big changes. In fact, he presented a paper in 1972, a scientific paper called Predictability. Does the flap of butterfly wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas? Isn't that a great thing? Predictability. Does the flap of a butterfly's wings in Brazil set off a tornado in Texas? His conclusion was no. But he said this: it can start a chain reaction leading to giant changes in global weather patterns. And it's true. You know, sometimes they say it's a 100% chance of rain and it doesn't rain. What happened? They would call it the butterfly effect. Something small happened that changed the weather globally. And the reason I tell you that is because that's what happens when you spend time with Jesus. You think it's just a small thing. Spending time with him, reading my Bible, making sure my heart stays in communion with him throughout. It's a small thing. You know, but what James says is it will result in global climactic changes. It'll change your life because it's the wisdom that comes down from above. Would you pray with me?